Well, Easter Monday, the sky is blue and we're turning the clock back now as we head for Dublin's O'Connell Street, which is absolutely thronged. As you know, many people dressed in period costume. It's time for our History Show special from Dublin City Centre.
The History Show with Myles Dungan.
Good afternoon from the GPO in Dublin, where we're bringing you this special edition of the History Show from our Road to the Rising event. It's a glorious day here in Dublin. The city centre has been taken over and is thronged. And let's go straight out now to O'Connell Street, where Tara Lockery-Grant is standing by. Tara, what is happening out near where you are?
Amazing. There are thousands and thousands of people here, Myles. Queues going up to the vintage carousel. Queues for all areas. Just the perfect weather. The music hall stage is really, you can probably hear it in the background. The tram is amazing. The mobile library, the Cinemobile. Crowds of families at the wedding, the Edwardian wedding and funeral at opposite ends of O'Connell Street. I'm currently in the tents where the professionals are showing us how it was done in 1915. I'm here in Louis Copeland's tent. Beside me is the Gur cake tent. The cakes are only on the tray and they are whipped away again. They're so tasty. We've got the hair tent, the Cat's Meow with Maureen Smith, well-known Irish hairdresser who worked on the Wind That Shakes the Barley and many other great TV shows like Ripper Street. Waldorf Barber's next to her. John Shevlin, the milliner, is there showing how hats were made in 1915, and Ger Buckley is there as well, showing in the Cooper tent how it was all done back in the day. A stunning day, so much to see for people. If you're wondering what to do, get yourself into town. You have young, old, everybody, but sunglasses are on and there's a wide range of us to see. A brilliant day, 300 actors on the street dressed in 1915 style. I have got the boat hat on as well, Myles.
Tara, thank you very much indeed. Tara stationed in our tented village just up from the GPO, and as she said, amongst the market and tradespeople of 1915. O'Connell Street completely pedestrianised today. It belongs to the people, so please come on down. It is a fabulous day here in Dublin, and O'Connell Street well worth a visit. Louis Lovett, Master of Ceremonies of our music hall stage, has just popped in, is looking very dapper indeed in top hat and tail. Well, you've actually doffed the top hat at the moment. Thank you very much indeed. Showing a bit of respect here, because our music today is largely what people would have listened to 100 years ago. So to help us step back to 1915, give us a blast of a popular song of the time.
I would be delighted to, Myles.
Trotting to the fair, me and Malmaloney seated, I declare, on a single pony. How am I to know that Moll is safe behind, with our heads in all that awkward way inclined? By her gentle breathing whispered past my ear, and her white arms wreathing warm around me here. Ding, diggy, ding, diggy, ding, diggy, ding. Thus on Dobbin's back I discoursed the darling, till upon our track leapt a mongrel snarling, as his mallet frightened that the pony'll start. And her pretty hands they tightened around my happy heart, till I asked her, may I steal a kiss or so? And my Molly's grey eye didn't answer no. Ding diggy ding diggy ding ding ding.
It wasn't just the singing, it was the gesticulation as well. Louis, thank you very, very much indeed. And among the other treats on the music hall stage, Jack L and Declan O'Rourke. We better let you get back to MC the music hall stage. And we also have a stage on a century-old tram, which is pretty much outside the GPO, next to our tented village, where hairdressers, as you heard there from Tara, tailors, barrel makers from the era are showing how it's done. That's alongside a vintage carousel with free rides for kids. So a very different scene than you'd expect to encounter on O'Connell Street these days. Back in 1915, O'Connell Street, Sackville Street as it was then, would have been quite a busy place, though, with solicitors' offices sitting alongside those of retailers. Louise Denver took a stroll down the street with tour guide Pat Liddy to get a sense of the atmosphere on the street back then.
Behind the O'Connell Monument walking up O'Connell Street Lower, traces of the old Sackville Street are still present.
The General Post Office, which is the iconic centre, if you like, was a much smaller building. It had the same width of front, but it only went back about 1/3 of the current building. And looking across at the statue of Cuchulainn in the big window in the centre, the statue wasn't there in 1915, and that was the actual door into the GPO. Everybody went into the GPO to buy their stamps, to send telegram messages and so forth. And they actually, in 1915, were redecorating and refurbishing the General Post Office, a job that was only finished in March 1916. So the citizens only enjoyed 1 month of a refurbished GPO before it was pulverised again.
Today, a busker plays the saxophone beside the James Joyce statue. 100 years ago, an organ grinder played.
Poor people and the well-to-do and the middle class and the working class used to love to window shop in somewhere like O'Connell Street. Even when the shops were closed, you would window shop.
Number 40 was Easton and Son. Number 35 was Cap and Peterson Tobacconists, whose sign is still above Starbucks on the corner beside the River Liffey, and Cleary and Company was at number 27.
That, in fact, was the world's first purpose-built department store, believe it or not. In 1915, the bottom 2 floors were the Cleary's department store, and the top floors were the Imperial Hotel. You couldn't select your own goods except to point them out in a glass case. You couldn't go ruffling through clothes. This was a cash-only store. In other words, you paid for everything by cash, whereas all the other stores, Arnott's, Brown Thomas, Switzer's and so on, you had to have a credit account. They still had the old pneumatic system where you paid the money to the clerk, but he wasn't allowed to give you the change. And it went up, a pneumatic tube system went off up to the cash office. Then the money came down from the cash office some time later. You might have to wait 10 minutes for your money to come back.
'43 and '44 were Manfield and Sons boot and shoe manufacturers. Number 52 was Wright and Company tailors. And number 32 was Dunn & Company hat makers.
You have to remember, people had to be careful displaying their fashions on streets that were essentially muddy, dirty with manure and all sorts of rubbish that was thrown around. That's the unglamorous side of any street in Dublin in those days. The ladies with their big bonnets and their flowing skirts, the men with their boater hats and so forth, especially on a fine day. Mixed with the people in the boaters and the bonnets were, of course, the chiselers, the youngsters from all the slums, which were on 3 sides of O'Connell Street. And, of course, kids couldn't stay at home those days because they were too crowded and they had to come out onto the streets.
Leprechaun Cartoon Monthly, Mus Maguire's typewriting school and mineral water manufacturer A&R Thwaites found themselves beside the offices of farming, religious and sporting organisations.
So we'll walk down past the spar, the old site of Nelson's Pillar. In 1915, people could walk up the 168 steps up to the top of Nelson Pillar by just paying 6pence. But in 1915, this is where the tram tracks were. And the trams from the north side all ended at the Pillar, and at the south side they all ended at the Pillar. So this was really a transport hub, an extremely busy street.
In 1915, at 17A and number 18, Frank W. Chambers was a taxi cab depot. Today, standing on the median of the street beside the Savoy Cinema, there's a long queue of taxis in the rank.
As well as the Ambassador, there were 2 other cinemas on the street. One was the Pillar, which is where McDonald's Hamburgers is now, just as you come up from Dublin Bus on the way to Henry Street. And then beyond that again, at Lower O'Connell Street, there was the Sackville. And of course they only showed silent films, and you had to have your orchestra inside. Now, we're just outside the Gresham. It was a very classy hotel. And inside there would have been elegant ballrooms, restaurants. The old building, of course, was originally a number of Georgian houses. The street was a very, very different place.
Louise Denver there with Pat Liddy on O'Connell Street. Of course, just a stone's throw from the grand boulevard that was Sackville Street as it was in 1915, stood the Monto, Europe's biggest red light district, as well as some of the worst slums in the continent of Europe. We were also a country ensconced in World War I in 1915. Many of our sons fighting in France and in Belgium, soon to be fighting in Gallipoli. But why, despite news of rising casualties, did recruitment to the British Army continue to be still relatively strong in 1915? I put this to Professor Joe Lee of New York University when I caught up with him a little bit earlier.
The enlistment figures are very interesting. You get about 80,000 by the end of 1915, 43,000 in the first 5 months of 1914. And then you get 37,000 to the following August. And then they begin dropping sharply. You get only about 5,000 for every 6 months to the last 3 months of the war. And then something very interesting. The figures shoot up to nearly 10,000 for the last 3 months of the war.
Except 56% of them joined the RAF.
Well, now, you've taken the words out of my mouth. You've done your homework, by God. They do. And that is interesting, too, because the RAF is just coming in. Air war is just coming in. Most of them are not pilots, obviously. They're working on the ground. But it means, A, they're working probably at jobs they actually enjoy doing. So they're not in the trenches. They're not in the very front line because the plane's obviously a bit behind the line. So a lot of skilled tradesmen in various capacities are probably working at their own work that they would be working at home if there were jobs at home for them.
In terms of Irish jobs in 1915 and enlistment, one group that certainly was not joining up were the farmers.
Absolutely.
They were having a very good time of it, weren't they?
No, recruitment in Ireland in general is about half what it is in Britain. Before conscription comes in Britain. The farmers are doing well, prices are rising, England needs the food, so they're doing well. And it's quite instructive that recruitment in the western half of the country is actually lower than it is in the eastern half of the country, despite the fact that you can have tillage in the eastern half of the country and so on. But when I say it's instructive, it's a combination of things. You see, I argued once and I was shot down for it, or half shot down for it. You're never fully shot down. You can see, fire a shot when you're in a prone position. About exaggerating the difference between recruitment in England before conscription and in Ireland, with English levels roughly double the Irish levels over a good part of the country. And it being pointed out to me that in England, recruitment from agricultural areas was distinctly less than from urban areas. And that's quite true. It still left recruitment in Ireland lower. But what hadn't occurred to me then, there's about 80,000 young men who would have been emigrants to America over those 4 years, who couldn't go. And a lot of them are lolling at home. Some of them, no doubt, joined the forces. But you would expect a significantly higher percentage, I think, of recruitment from Ireland, whatever interpretation one puts on it, all right? And it can be ideologised, obviously, and so on, than actually happened. So there's a lot of impatient young men in Ireland by 1918. And I suspect that the IRA were able to draw on many of those in the post-war period.
1915 was also a crucial year in the life of the Gaelic League.
That's
because
right.
It was the year of the resignation of the great founder of the Gaelic League,
Yes.
Douglas Hyde. Tell us what was going on there.
Well, you're
that
quite
caused
right.
that.
And it's ironic in a way, because Hyde wanted a totally non-political Gaelic League. Eschewing politics, the language belongs to all of us, irrespective of our politics. Now, by 1915, the IRB and those members of the Gaelic League who were IRB, which would include Pearse, by the way, were getting impatient with that. The big confrontation, which they expected to be big, remember. They weren't thinking of 1916 as it happened. They were thinking of German guns. They were thinking of a far bigger conflagration in the country. They wanted to get the Gaelic League on side, officially, formally on side ideologically, as supportive of their position. And Hyde didn't want that. We had to keep politics out. The great irony is that his successor was Owen MacNeill, who the following year would be marginalised as well in terms of what happened by those who were pulling the strings in the Gaelic League.
And would it be fair to say that by 1915 that the IRB had pretty much already done the same thing with the GAA, for example?
Yes, yeah. Probably more receptive response in many quarters there than in, say, in Douglas Hyde's sense.
When the rebellion came, it was blamed on an organisation that had virtually nothing to do with it. It was the Sinn Féin rebellion.
It revived Sinn Féin.
Where was Sinn Féin in 1950?
Sinn Féin was virtually moribund. It wasn't. It had devoted adherents, but it wasn't going anywhere. Its policy of, in a sense, almost passive resistance in a way, non-support, but nothing much else basically for the war. It just wasn't winning adherents. It hadn't won many adherents since its foundation, in all honesty. The one time it set up a parliamentary candidate, Dolan in Leitrim, he didn't do disgracefully badly, but he got maybe 1/3 or 1/4 of the nationalist vote against the Home Rule Party.
Very interesting election agent. Sean McDermott, I think, was his election agent.
Fascinating. You're dead right.
Yeah. Now, I mean, we're here to commemorate, ultimately we will be here this time next year to commemorate the centenary of the 1916 Rising. We're here to commemorate the centenary of 1915. But in 1915, would even radical nationalists have thought 12 months from now there will be a rebellion that will lock up Dublin for a week?
No, I suspect not. I suspect the majority of radical nationalists wouldn't have been thinking in such concrete and such close distance terms. Now remember, however, that the IRB was originally hoping for something in September 1915 and might have had something if the Germans had sent on guns at that particular stage. But the Germans were dithering as to what they would do. And it was only when they realised, when the IRB knew the German guns had been promised for a definite date, etc., that they actually began to flex their muscles in a way that is anticipating a specific rising and had plans for the rising, much more ambitious plans, obviously, we know, than actually occurred, because when everything went wrong on Easter Sunday, only a fraction of the numbers they had intended or hoped would come out did so they had to moderate their plans. So only a handful of buildings were occupied. And it was really, I often say, Easter Monday is not Easter Sunday postponed by a day. It's an entirely different rising. So we have to be aware of that was a 24-hour patch-up job. And if we look at that as what they were working towards, you think they're daft, because they're going on to die. It's crazy. But that wasn't the rising they were planning.
And we tend to think of John Redmond by 1918 as having shot as bolt as being yesterday's man. Was he yesterday's man in 1915? Were the seeds already there?
Not at all. Well, you can say the seeds were there in the sense that it's very hard to see how any arrangement in Ulster or Northern Ireland, etc., other than partition, was going to emerge as the best option. When I say the best option, the most they could get under the Home Rule aegis, particularly, you see, when the Tories, under Andrew Bonar Law, remember, the ultimate, representative of Ulster Unionism, even though he's out of the country, but he's the son of an Ulster Presbyterian minister, the Tories are now in government. They're not just the opposition, they're in government. So how on earth are you going to get a deal for Ireland, you're going to get Home Rule for Ireland, imposed on a government, which is Andrew Bonar Law, as in many respects the strong man, when you couldn't get it earlier on?
Carson was in the cabinet in 1915. And Redmond was offered a cabinet position. Yes, did he make a mistake in not taking it, do you think?
It's very hard to say. I would hate to be in his shoes, and I wouldn't condemn him at all for not taking it. I think his fear was not that he wouldn't perform effectively in cabinet, although he would probably got a fairly minor posting in all fairness, but that he would open the floodgates in Ireland to possible alternatives to Home Rule, because he could now be pilloried as one of them.
Now, his party, I mean, we tend to think of it as being a kind of a monolithic, unified party, but even in 1915 there were schisms. There were schisms within the party, and you had William O'Brien, the All for Ireland League. So that kind of monolithic parnellism of the 1880s, was gone by 1915, wasn't it?
Nevertheless, Redmond was a recognised leader of nationalist Ireland. I mean, he was being sniped at from various angles, inside and outside, but he was a recognised leader. He seemed to have done wonders in getting Home Rule on the statute book with all the qualifications. Remember, the length of the war makes a huge difference. It's on the statute book to be for a year, or until the war ends, whichever is the longer. Now, Redmond has to make his calculations. In 1914, the war will be over within a year. A lot of people said the boys will be home by Christmas. So what do you do in those circumstances? He doesn't see himself postponing confrontation on the issues for 4 years. He doesn't all be dead at the time, for that matter. So we always have to ask, what is the best decision on the balance of probabilities at the time, not knowing what's coming next? Hindsight is a wonderful way of being always right.
And in 1915, would there have been much evidence of radical movements in Ireland who were opposed to recruitment, who were in favour of women getting the vote, for example, who
not
were
always
socialists?
the same people, by the way.
Not always. Oh no, absolutely not. Socialists as well. Or were they? You had this act, this kind of umbrella act, the Defence of the Realm Act, which basically was the British government saying we can do whatever we want for the duration of the war. Did that keep all of this in check? Was there very little evidence on the streets of any kind of opposition?
Honestly, I don't think there was that much. I mean, there was a certain amount because the IRB people are sort of disguised as volunteers, so to speak, are doing marches.
But that's covert.
Absolutely.
I mean, are there people going out and marching and protesting and getting arrested?
There isn't. No. 1915 is a quite peaceful year. It's a quite prosperous year for Ireland. And so, in a sense, the volunteers are seen almost, I think, as marginal. These odd creatures who are engaging in this.
These are the ones now who didn't go with Redmond.
That's right.
Redmond.
Oh yes, the
Irish volunteers.
The Irish volunteers, the IB. Owen McNeill's crowd until Owen McNeill decides he's not going in that direction. All right. There would be evidence of them marching along. They'd almost become, by 1916, by late 1915, they become almost a fixture. Oh, there's a bunch of volunteers going to practicing something or other. And in a way, they had become almost domesticated in terms of public perception. Yes, let them play their games. You know, they're decent chaps.
Let them march out to Wicklow and back
Precisely. That's the way they want to spend their time. That's their business. They're bothering nobody.
Now, one of our events today is a news production, Yellow, whose central figures are women with yellow hands who worked in munitions factories. Now, in reality, though, Ireland did not greatly benefit, did it not, from the war economy, certainly from an industrial point of view. Farming and food production, yes, but from an industrial point of view, no.
No, but that was basically because it wasn't industrialised. I mean, Belfast benefits, obviously, right? But Belfast already has the shipyards in place, etc., etc. Dublin doesn't. Ireland as a whole. Rural Ireland does, in the sense that the agricultural prices are good. But if we're talking about the towns, Irish towns simply had not reached the stage of economic development, and that includes Dublin, which made them constructive contributors to the war effort from a British perspective. Far more sensible to actually give the work to factories in Britain than the factories that weren't in Ireland.
So, therefore, the picture that I'm getting of Ireland in 1915 is of a relatively tranquil country, to some extent, or to a great extent, I suppose, on a war footing, but with no sense whatever of what was going to happen 12 months on.
I think that's pretty fair. I think if you asked anybody in April 1915 what will be happening in Dublin in a year's time...
The same,
exactly. And who could blame them? After all, one of the achievements of the rebels in 1916 was to keep most of what they were planning secret. And that hadn't happened too often in Irish history.
Joe Lee, thank you very much indeed. Professor Joe Lee speaking to me there before his public interview at the Abbey Theatre. That starts in a few minutes if you want to catch that. Lots and lots of talks going on around the city, around the general area of O'Connell Street, being given by historians in the Gresham, in Wynn's Hotel, in the Abbey and in Liberty Hall. We, meanwhile, are on the balcony above the main lobby of the General Post Office. The noise you can hear behind us, or rather underneath us, is the members of the general public who are talking to staff from the National Library. And that staff, they're examining and they are assessing artefacts from the revolutionary period being brought in by members of the public for their assessment. Join us after the break for more of our RTE Road to the Rising event on Dublin's O'Connell Street.
The History Show on RTE Radio 1, live from RTE Road to the Rising.
Welcome back to our special programme from RTE's Road to the Rising on Dublin's O'Connell Street. We are on the balcony of the GPO overlooking the main lobby. Today the street belongs to pedestrians, and we're inviting everyone to come along, step back into history to experience the sights and sounds of 100 years ago. Our own Keelan Shanley, historian Paul Rouse of UCD, and Alan Titley, Professor Emeritus from University College Cork, are all involved in today's event, and they've dropped in for a quick chat. Before we hear from them, though, let's go to Lorcan Clancy on O'Connell Street.
Thank you, Myles. I'm here on O'Connell Street and there's so many things going on. There's 2 music stages, there's a steam engine, there's a vintage carousel, but 1915 is really being brought to life by the many actors in period dress. And I spoke to a few of them earlier who are reenacting a funeral from 1915.
This funeral was a man the name of John Patrick O'Neill, and he was rushing across the road to get flowers for his wife. Well, we think it may have been for the wife, but he was hit by a tram.
What's your name, sir?
Dennis Murray.
And what role are you playing?
Well, I'm a mourner at the funeral, and I'm not a formal actor. I have no acting experience. I just came up to participate for the day and travelling from Carlow.
And how are you enjoying? Are you getting into the spirit of 1915?
Yeah, well, especially with so many other people in appropriate attire for the day. So yeah, it's good. There's a good feeling about the city.
My name is Paddy Riley. I was acquainted with the deceased wife. He was a very decent man. Yes, he would. He'd give you 2 halfpennies for a penny. You know, that type of person, yeah. Mind you, we had a great night last night at the wake. Less said about that, the better.
Hello, my name's David McKeever, and I'm just loving this whole day, and I just love the atmosphere. I love the sense of the dressing and the memories being evoked.
And I also met a party of 5 actors who are celebrating a communion day.
My name's Anya, so we're all part here of a communion. It's Leisha's communion day, so the whole family is out celebrating.
What do you think of the weather today? You must be very warm.
I am boiling. I'm wearing a kind of traditional kind of knit jumper as well underneath this. But I'm doing it all for my little sister, so it's okay.
How are you enjoying your communion day?
It's great, and I'm really excited that all my brothers and sisters are here and family. It's really exciting.
And in 1915 as well.
Yeah, I have like a purse, and then I have an umbrella, and you can lay that down on your elbow and then twirl it around and open it.
Brilliant. So that's just a taste of what's going on out on O'Connell Street. But for now, it's back to you, Myles, in the GPO.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Lorcan. As I said, I'm joined by Keelan Shanley, Paul Rouse and Alan Titley. Just in general terms, starting with you, Keelan, what, as far as you're concerned, what have you seen happening out there? What is happening out there? What's grabbed you so far?
Well, I've been wandering around O'Connell Street for about the last 2 hours with my own family, and I tell you, the kids are just captivated by what's going on. The singing in particular, there's a kind of a group of male singers on top of an old tram. They're very taken by that.
The Brook Singers.
Thank you. I didn't know who it was. It's quite chaotic out there. I mean, it's really busy. There's a lot of people, so it's a great sense of excitement. The other thing that they were really taken by is there's quite a lot of buildings displaying old photographs of O'Connell Street. So, you know, you can see the Ambassador Theatre back in 1915, the trams going up and down O'Connell Street, the costumes, not the costumes, they were their everyday clothes, but they were really captivated by that. Myself, I loved there's a couple of cars there and a steam engine. Steam engine was a big hit. I noticed with men aged about 60. I think there must have been about 20 of them there just in awe of
there
the steam engine.
There is nothing like a train to get a 60-year-old boy activated, isn't there? Paul, what about yourself?
I was in the Abbey all morning, and the Brook Singers, who were later on the street, they opened the Abbey by singing Danny Boy. But I think the thing that struck me most about the Abbey happened before everything started. At 10 to 11, Michael D. Higgins walked in. He is there as an ordinary citizen, a citizen of a republic. Without pomp and ceremony, walked in and took a seat in the middle of the crowd and sat down, stayed for the whole of the morning and is going back for the afternoon.
That's what we have a republic for.
Yes. Yeah. Alan, what's impressed you? What have you enjoyed so far? I know you've been
I came in fairly early in the morning. I was walking around, so I saw things before things took off at 11 o'clock, and then I've been talking and running around since then, trying to fight my way to get into GPO. To tell you the truth, I had to get barge my way through lots of people, but there's a great to use at least. There's a great buzz around the place. I never saw Sackville Street so beautiful, and so do you.
Thank you for giving it the proper name.
Along the way, and I noticed people selling flags, Irish flags, which wouldn't have happened in 1915.
Yeah, I mean, the status of the Irish flag, because it was basically the tricolour flying over this same building in 1916 that essentially gave us our national flag, Paul, wasn't it?
Yes, and there's a brilliant story told of an American journalist driving through on an open-top bus through the streets of New York in 1918. And she had in her hand a tricolour as she went through, just to see what the reaction. And she said as she went by every street corner, the police in the city saluted. And of course there were Irish people there, and the tricolour in those years between 1916, immediately it gained a currency which it never previously had.
I'm told, I'm not sure if this is true, but that there was also the Fenian flag, which would have been the kind of the national flag up to that point, which was the green harp and the blue background. But it was also flying, but it wasn't as visible. I'm not no idea whether that's true or not.
And the Plough and the Stars flew as well.
Of course,
you have a range of different flags. There was no one symbol.
I think there was a tradition of a tricolour going back as far as the French Revolution, because they introduced the idea of a tricolour.
And Thomas Francis Meagher brought it over in 1848. Keelan, you're off to the Gresham to host talks on ordinary life in 1915. What's happening there? Who's talking there?
I think it's going to be a really interesting few hours there. Elaine Sisson is going to be speaking about popular culture and everyday life. So I suppose, we look back at that period. We're very much focused on, World War I was happening, that it was coming up to the rising. We're looking at the kind of the political background, what was going on, whereas this is how were people actually living. Another of the talks, going to the movies in 1915, Ruth Barton from Trinity is going to be giving that. And it's just the number of movie theatres within of a stone's throw of the GPO. I think there were 25 different movie theatres. You could get in for as little as a penny, or you could exchange 2 jam jars for a seat in a cinema. And it was just very much a part of everyday life. It was where people got a lot of their information about what was going on in the world as well, with the newsreels that would be shown. We're also going to be hearing from Lisa Marie Griffith, and also Dr. Joseph Brady. And I think that's one going to be really interesting too. Quality of life and life of the quality. The difference between rich and the poor and the way in which they lived in Dublin in 1915.
Alan, the Irish language. Would a lot of people have been speaking Irish in 1915? I know, obviously, right throughout the 19th century, the numbers had gone down, and they would never have been great in Dublin to begin with. But what had been the status in 1915?
Well, the census, the only one that we know of before that, in 1900, which was kind of a base that we could start talking, because the revolution was beginning, the Cultural Revolution at that time, there were something like 640,000 native speakers, but probably very few learners. The number of learners of Irish would only begun to take off when it was introduced slowly and very painfully into the schools, because you had something like 9,000 schools in Ireland in 1900, and Irish was taught in only 180 or 190 of them, and that was outside school hours, even in Irish-speaking areas. So what was happening was a huge revolution, and it happened with Gaelic League classes, although some people are quite cynical that the Gaelic League, of course, was men and women, and people going there more for meeting men and women rather than for learning Irish.
What's wrong with that? As long as they learn a bit of Irish as well.
But as well as that, you had Eugene O'Growney's Simple Lessons in Irish, which was published again at the turn of the century. It sold something like 36,000 copies within a year. Now, I'm not saying everybody learned a lot from it, but there was a lot of, I suppose, beginnings of Irish at the time.
The GAA, obviously the Gaelic League, was one of the great national bodies or national institutions of that period and of the Cultural Revolution. What was happening in the GAA in 1915?
I think the best thing that happened in the GAA in 1915 was a Munster Hurling Championship match between Cork and Limerick, which was proceeding pretty well towards an end until John Mackey, the father of Mick Mackey, got embroiled in a kind of an altercation in the field, and the match was abandoned. Involving supporters coming onto the field, people coming from every direction, and huge opprobrium heaped upon everyone. But of course, everyone loved it.
So you mean Cork didn't win that one?
Well, the Limerick boys did their equivalent.
When it was restaged. Who were the powerhouses, the football and hurling powerhouses of those days?
Laois won their only All-Ireland Hurling Championship in 1915. They haven't been back to win one since, but Wexford won the first of 4 in a row in football in 1915.
In football, so they were a football powerhouse back in 1915. Yes. Yeah, and re-emerging as a football powerhouse.
They won a handful of hurling. They didn't win any hurling championships until the 20th century, and then they took off, unfortunately, after that. So they were. But I think the powerhouse in hurling were still Cork and Tipperary at that stage, even though there were others as well.
And Paul, we've been talking, and we will be talking about looking forward, if you like, to 1916. Now, I know it's a bit unfair to do that because people didn't know what was going to happen a year hence. To what extent was the die cast already in relation to what was going to happen in 1916, 12 months beforehand?
Oh, well, the die wasn't cast. You can't look at the early part of 1915 or the middle of 1915 and say, well, there's a revolution imminent here. The people who were agitating for revolution, the people who were fighting, were a very, very small minority. They had a very limited supply of arms. They tried to imagine a situation where they could rise. They were determined to rise. but they had no ability to rise, no capability to rise. It took a restructuring of the IRB. It took a particular set of circumstances in early 1916 to bring them to rise, but there is no sense that this was an inevitability at all.
There were cabals and cliques all the time, but in fact the IRB met a month after the outbreak of the First World War, and the IRB were determined on some kind of revolution. The question was how much and to what extent would it be justified. So there were certainly ideas about it, but as you said, it certainly wasn't planned.
And there had been no rebellion since 1867. Yes, there had been land war in the early 1880s with all that entailed, but it's 1867, back to 1848, back to 1803, and very minor events on all of those occasions.
And you do have the continuity with Tom Clark going not quite back to 1867, but almost all the way back. Okay, well, I'm going to introduce or talk about something now which Alan Titley, being of a certain age, and myself being of a certain age, would remember, but Paul and Keelan far, far too young to remember this, because one of today's events is the first screening in almost 50 years of the groundbreaking RTÉ drama series Insurrection, all 8 episodes. That's on now at the Liberty Hall Theatre. Back in 1966, this drama, broadcast nightly, told the story of the Rising as it might have unfolded had television existed in 1916, with Ray McAnally as the anchor. Over the past couple of weeks, we invited some of the actors who appeared in this innovative production to share their memories with us half a century on.
My name is Kevin Flood. I was cast to play Dee O'Reilly, and it's been a long walk down memory lane ever since I've done that.
My name is Sean McCarthy. I played the role of Jim Ryan back in 1966. Jim Ryan was a medical student. He was also a volunteer and was the only medical person in the GPO in the first couple of days of the conflict.
Well, the script was written by Hugh Leonard, and he was a master of his craft at that stage.
The idea was literally to bring you there into the heart of the action, with a newsroom, with an anchorman who had a map of Dublin on the wall, and then 2 sets of roving reporters who went around and interviewed the participants in the rebellion from day one onwards and linked back to the studio. It was a very brave way of doing it. Whether people today would buy into the concept or not, I have no idea.
This wonderful idea of using Ray McNally, a very young Ray McNally, as the presenter of each of the programmes.
McAnally, of course, was a very slick, charismatic actor. His personality was one of the things that made the concept work. His belief in the concept, his ability to take the audience there.
Ethna Lydon. I played James Connolly's secretary, Miss Carney, and she had very little to say, but she was right through the thing.
The casting of it was interesting, because actors for this particular programme were cast according to their build, their height, their size. The casting was done as near as possible they could get to the characters that they were playing.
Kevin McHugh is my name. I can't remember the name of the character, but it was one of the men in the Mount Street siege. There were 6 or 7 of us in there.
There wasn't actually an auditioning process. I think almost every free actor in Ireland had some kind of role in Insurrection. It was an enormous cast.
Barry Castle. Someone tells me I played Desmond Fitzgerald. It was the biggest television thing that had been done.
And we had Louis Lenton producing. He was very meticulous. He was a perfectionist, really.
Well, Louis had an enormous job to do. The whole thing, mechanically, of recording something in the studio then was very, very difficult. The cameras were enormous. You didn't have the editing facilities you have now. Tape was very expensive. If you fluffed a scene, you had to go back right to the beginning of the scene and record it again. It was very, very difficult.
I'll always remember the burning of the post office, the set of the post office. It was a great atmosphere of excitement. There was a sort of an aura of danger about the place, and management were up the walls about insurance problems and all.
So the post office was duly burned, and it was discovered that there were some scenes still to be done, and part of the post office had to be rebuilt.
We were very aware that it was very original, and this was very different. It was enormously popular. It caused great excitement.
I don't know how many of the actors actually managed to see the broadcast, because many of the actors were living in London, or it's so easy now to just press a button and you have a recording, you can play it back. That was not available then. You either saw the transmission or you didn't. It's a long time ago for me now. That's why I'm so looking forward to seeing it again.
And we heard there from Barry Casson, Kevin Flood, Ethna Lydon, Sean McCarthy and Kevin McHugh, all of whom appeared in Telefís Éireann's Insurrection in 1966, as indeed did Mike Murphy. Kind of a spear carrier, third spear carrier from the left type of thing. And if you want to catch the last few episodes of Insurrection, get over to Liberty Hall Theatre, where we're showing the whole series in one day. And staying in the general area of film, Ruth Barton, lecturer in film studies at Trinity College, joins us to give us a flavour of the vibrant cinema scene in 1915. Keelan already referred to it when she was talking to us a few minutes back. How many cinemas were around the O'Connell Street, Sackville Street area 100 years ago?
Well, actually, on O'Connell Street, Sackville Street, there were three full cinemas on just the one street, and then that doesn't include the Rotunda, which is right up at the end of the street. And Dublin was, if you think Dublin was a very, very small place, there were 25 cinemas in Dublin by 1915, which is really huge, and some of them would have been vast, and the smaller ones only seated, 200 to 300, and that would have been true of, say, the Pillar cinema, the Picture House, which is by the Pillar, obviously, but some of the bigger ones seated in the thousands. So the actual amount of tickets you could buy, if you like, in Dublin at that time was massive, and the programmes ran continuously too. It's very, very different to now. So you could just walk in, watch around the clock, if you like, of your programme, and then you walked out again. So people didn't plan to meet their friend at 3 and go to the cinema. They would just meet their friend and go to the cinema, and wherever it was, they'd sit down and start watching it, and then when they had got round the clock on that programme, they'd pick up and leave again.
And the theatre owners felt very threatened by this huge growth, this huge upsurge in interest in the cinema, didn't they?
Yes, and what really threatened them was it wasn't so bad for them, because initially it was the tenement kids who were going to the cinema when it was more of a kind of fairground attraction. But by this stage, by 1915, the cinemas were making a really concerted effort to get the middle classes in, and they were showing not just the Perils of Pauline and Mabel Normand comedies, but they were showing very, very classy feature-length films by this stage, and that was what really scared the theatre owners, because it was cheaper, it was convenient, and it was very, very safe to go to the cinema. And particularly what the interesting thing is, it was very attractive to women as well. So a lot of those women going to the kind of classier theatres, if you like, say Grafton Street, were out for a day shopping. They'd meet a female friend. Well, you couldn't go to the pub, obviously, and meet your female friend. You could go to a tea house and you could go to the cinema. And so what the cinemas even started doing was serving tea and biscuits to get those Grafton Street lady shoppers in.
1915 was the year in which D.W. Griffith made Birth of a Nation, but that would it have been exceptional in terms of the output of what we now think of as Hollywood? What kind of movies were being made during that period?
They're really, really divided between those short serials, more like TV now, so running for, say, 20 minutes, where you watch an episode every week, and the draw is you come back because you have a cliffhanger at the end. And so that was one form that is pretty much gone. But you did have, already by that stage, quite a lot of feature-length films, and they would have been coming. Don't forget, it didn't matter what language they were in, because they were silent, right? So the Italians were producing a lot of historical epics, and Griffith, as you say, Cecil B. DeMille, they were all starting to really, really come forth at this stage. And so there was a really wide range of films that you could see from all around the world, because all you had to have was an English intertitle rather than an Italian intertitle, and you've got your audience.
And do we know what actual movies were on over the Easter period of 1915?
There were, well, of course, there were lots and lots that we'll never be able to retrieve, but fortunately you can actually watch 2 of them online, or snippets of one. So not surprisingly, the Rotunda was showing The Messiah, which was a remake, and often what they did in those days was they'd show a film, they'd change its title, they'd show it again the next year, they'd change its title, they'd show it again the next year, so you're watching the same film. So this was actually an older French film. They'd changed its title a couple of times. They'd actually showed it in 1914 successfully, so they bunged it on again in 1915. But if you go online, it's great. You can actually see a lovely kind of the Messiah basically arises from a trapdoor in the stage and glides towards heaven. So I think that people were brought in to see it because it was reverent, but it was also fun because it showed the latest technology. And then if you went to the Sackville Picture House in O'Connell Street, you were actually able to see a film called The Property Man, and the title mightn't mean anything to you, but its star and director were Charlie Chaplin.
Oh, right.
And if you go onto YouTube, you can see the whole film. It still survives.
And how much was the average cinema ticket at that stage, or did it vary depending on how classy the cinema was?
It very much varied. The kids could get in for a penny on the matinees and sit on benches, but generally it was threepence for the cheap seats, sixpence for the better seats, and then some of the posher cinemas had a shilling for the balconies, and that was the top range. So it wasn't even that expensive.
But it was becoming something that the whole family could do, or the whole family did do?
The whole family could do, but also you felt safe in sending your kids out to do it, and I think that was a real advantage for the slum families, and for many families, that you couldn't always let your kids out, or you might worry about them. Here you knew they were going to be safe, they were going to be in a safe place, and they always had somebody kind of shepherding them into the seats and shepherding them out again. So the kids would have gone on their own without their parents, and then in the middle class whole family would have gone for kind of cultural afternoon, because you could go in the middle of the day, you didn't have to wait until the evening.
But how many are you talked about that you could go in and you could stay for an extraordinary amount of time? At what point would the programme begin to change, and would you now be seeing something that you'd seen maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours earlier?
Yeah, an hour and a half, because what they do is approximately an hour and a half, depending on the picture house. What they do is they just string them together. They'd actually splice them together on the projector, so they just put one after another, and you just walk in and watch it. And it's different for the features, obviously, for the D.W. Griffith type things, because you went in. You could even go into those in the middle and see it to the end, and then start again at the beginning if you so wished.
Ruth Barton, thank you very much indeed. And if you'd like to get a flavour of the silent movie era, we're showing a selection of shorts in our Cinemobile on O'Connell Street, courtesy of the Irish Film Institute. For full details of what is happening down here on O'Connell Street today, check out rte.ie/1916. Stay with us for Dermot Ferriter and Roy Foster just after the break.
The History Show on RTE Radio 1, live from RTE Road to the Rising.
Welcome back to the History Show, coming from the balcony of the GPO overlooking the main lobby in Dublin's O'Connell Street. For one day only, the street belongs to pedestrians, as we invite everyone to come along and step back into history to experience the sights and sounds of 100 years ago. Lots of family activities here on O'Connell Street as part of RTE's Road to the Rising, illustrating entertainment, transport and social life here in 1915, and exhibitions and talks galore in many, many different venues, dealing with subjects as diverse as food, sport, poverty and politics. Two eminent historians indeed, giving talks today are Dermot Ferriter and Roy Foster. Dermot is actually on stage at the Abbey Theatre at the moment, so a little while ago I caught up with them to ask what the rebel leaders were up to a year before the Rising.
They're not talking necessarily about bread and butter issues. If you look at Pearse, for example, and again the context of the First World War is hugely important there. By the end of 1915, he is saying, we have lived through the most glorious 16 months in the history of Europe. It's the bloodshed, it's the example that's been given by the battlefields, and he becomes very fixated on that, and this idea that there needs to be an Irish manifestation of what that means, what that European sacrifice means. So I suppose their heads are in the clouds to a certain extent. They also are very preoccupied with a very simplistic version of Irish history and of Irish nationalism. There's a lot of wishful thinking about the idea of the unity of the Irish race, and that finds its way eventually into the proclamation, that we'll be oblivious of the differences that have been fostered by an alien government. You don't have to confront them. There's something that have been imposed, and there's a tendency to look back and say that there was a pre-Norman paradise when this was a united race, and it will be a united race again.
I think when you talk about the people behind the Rising, though, you've got to make a certain separation between the people on the Military Council of the IRB, which in the last month of 1915 is put together, and these are the people who will be the signatories of the proclamation. But there's other people who have helped make the weather behind the radicalization of opinion. There's other people who have been, especially in the circles of women's politics, who've been very active in radicalizing, who will be taking a back seat from 1916, 17, 18 on. I think the pre-revolutionary mindset is at least as important as as Dermot has correctly said, the oversimplifications of the final revolutionary push.
And what is establishing that mindset, or what is working on that mindset in 1915, Dermot? Roy has mentioned, for example, radical newspapers, radical journalism. Was it that? Was it family background? Was it education? Was it even the plays that they were going to see? What was it?
I mean, Dublin this time 100 years ago was a real hive of theatrical activity, not just Dublin, other cities as well. A lot of people are thinking and they're talking and they're publishing. Roy's mentioned the newspapers. There are a huge amount of publications. A lot of them are very short-lived. They're very polemical. They're very aggressive. There's a tendency to target individuals, to target causes, and to excoriate your enemies. So the rhetoric is really emboldened throughout. And the longer the war goes on, that provides the backdrop and a kind of a suitable model for insurrection as far as some of them are concerned. So that immediacy is very relevant to them in 1915 and 1916. And yes, their education. Yes, these are people who are, we often refer to the Poets' Rebellion. There are people who are, writing poems. Some of it is awful, it has to be said. But they have that strong sense that they are bringing a heightened sensibility to what it means to be an Irish nationalist and what it means to be forging a new republic. Some of them are very well educated, some of them aren't. They represent different things. They have different preoccupations. There's an awful lot of subterfuge, there's a lot of deceit, there's a lot of secrecy, there's a lot of trying to keep what is being planned away from the eyes and the ears of those who are considered to be too moderate. And then you have those who fall in between the two stools. People like Arthur Griffith, for example, who has long moved away from the Irish Republican Brotherhood. And, he's preoccupied with economic issues, and he talks about the potency of economic nationalism. But he wouldn't have been particularly comfortable with this idea of the blood sacrifice. And he's looking back all the time to the constitutional tradition as well as the physical force tradition.
Nor would you be comfortable with socialism. He's distinctly anti-socialist. But the war is vital because it brings Griffith back as a player. After the Home Rule Party seems to be delivering Home Rule, 1910 to 1912, Sinn Féin starts declining. And people think it's shot its bolt. The war gets Griffith back into the mosquito press. It gets him back as a radical. It gets him back as, exactly as Dermot has said, a very combative voice. And the radicalising effect of that mosquito press in the years 1914, 15 up to 16 is vital, I think. Yeah.
Something else you also bring in to Vivid Faces, Roy, a lot of very interesting points, but one that really struck me was where you said the previous generation was often the perceived enemy every bit as much as the British government. To some extent, you're basically saying that radical nationalists are getting back at mum and dad.
I think it's a war on the parents' generation, which is seen as collaborationist, anglicising, materialistic, anti-idealistic, and prepared to put up with a kind of Ireland that is essentially a part of Britain, even if an autonomous part. And the war and Redmond's disastrous decision to back the war as powerfully as he did, of course, makes the Home Rule Party all the more identified with that. Because one thing that's very striking about these people is that they're young. Tom Clarke apart, and he's spotted as an exception. I think P.S. Hager says the one person of the previous generation who, stayed a proper Fenian radical. These people are young, and they are, I think, engaging in a war upon their parents' generation as well as on the British government. And the Home Rule Party represents that too.
It's interesting to look at what the Fenian tradition represents at that stage, because they are by and large young, but Tom Clarke is much older and is seen in a way as a kind of a father figure to some of the younger radicals, and he's writing letters about the inspiration that he's getting from the likes of Tomás McDonagh and Sean McDermott. They're young men, they're thinking men, but more important than that, they're going to follow through on their words. These are men of action.
And what you mentioned, Pearse. You mentioned what Pearse is writing about. Talking about the blood of a generation, which is which he refers to it in terms of wine and all this kind of stuff. And Connolly
it's also about arms, citizens being armed. A citizen without arms doesn't have any kind of manhood.
What in 1915? What would Pearse have been doing? What would Eamon de Valera, for example, have been doing in 1915?
Well, Pearse in 1915 is getting ready. There's no doubt that he is also, in a sense, trying to fashion an afterlife for himself and leave words behind that will explain what he was about. He's very focused on the organisational side of it, but he's also very focused on the conceiving of it as a drama, and it is conceived very much as a drama. So he's very concerned about that. There are others within that circle. They have their official positions on the volunteer executive. There's director of organisation, there's director of operations, there's director of military affairs, and they are looking at the nuts and bolts of it. and putting together the actual military strategy. And they do decide over the course of 1915, not just to form a military committee, which they do in the spring of 1915, but to decide by the end of the year on a date for the rising. And of course that was only going to be kept within a very, very tight circle. So it's a mixture of the practicalities of what will be involved. Joseph Plunkett ends up, for example, in Berlin. You know, if you look, placement has already gone out there. John Devoy, Clan McGale in America, is working behind the scenes to try and facilitate that trip. You know, what's going to transpire in terms of practical assistance?
And
from
Casement
Germany?
has been in Germany for over a year, we must remember. He's been there since late 1914. So the war, again, is dictating that. But what Dermot says about Pearse is absolutely right. And he finds time to write and put on a play in 1915, The Singer. You know, the whole, the manifestos are being created. The publicity is being created. And it's planned, as Dermot says, in a dramatic way. It's a gesture, a dramatic gesture.
And they're quite puritanical, Myles. I mean, they're, you know, these were not people who were going out boozing of an evening, you know. And I mean, the idea of previous rebellions that had been undermined by lack of discipline or, you know, a lack of attention to detail and by leaks and by informants, they're quite puritanical in how they approach it. So they're very fixated on what needs to be done and what needs to be kept secret. And I mean, even the Supreme Council of the IRB in early 1916 is in the dark. So it's, you know, the conspiracies within the conspiracies.
And presumably James Connolly in 1915 is making his own separate and parallel plans for his own rebellion.
That's what they get worried about, isn't it? By the end of 1915.
That's vital. And also that's what brings in Labour, but also what changes Connolly's, will change his reputation or his image from this rather anti-nationalist, internationalist into a nationalist before he is a socialist.
And I think it's vital for Connolly, again, the First World War backdrop, because that generates huge pessimism within Connolly about the possibility of a workers' republic. And of course he conceived of the Irish question as a social question, but he's now come to the conclusion, it seems, by the end of 1915, that the only way to achieve resolution of the social question is by establishing a republic first. So that's a vital transition. And the First World War is really what allows that to gestate in his mind. And again, you keep coming back to that context.
1915 is the year of Gallipoli, it's the year of the Lusitania, it's the year of tens of thousands of Irish volunteers fighting on the Western Front. I mean, and that's the background to all of this.
Dermot was talking about the cultural excitement that was going on at the time. People were going to plays. You know, you said yourself, Pearse was writing a play. So was there a sense of excitement in 1915 about what was going on in Ireland, or was it dominated by war weariness even at that stage?
I think war weariness and certainly disillusionment with the war is beginning to creep in. But sticking with the cultural point, 1915 is also the year, of course, when Hyde stands down from the presidency of the Gaelic League, and the extreme nationalists, many of whom have very limited language skills, take over. And culture is politicised in a very extreme sense. It may also be the point where a more pluralist, less perhaps single-minded but more inclusive form of cultural endeavour is subordinated to the idea of a Fenian rising, which is what of course will happen a year hence.
They also had very strongly held religious views and a strong religious faith, and you can see that obviously in working its way into the language of Pearse. The paradigm there is Christ and the crucifixion and the resurrection. So you have that particular model also. But we have to be careful too to keep coming back to the idea of a very small group. You know, I mean, there are disparate elements that come into what becomes referred to as the Sinn Féin programme or the Sinn Féin rebellion. There are many different layers to it, but you're still dealing with a relatively small group. I mean, Ireland could be described in 1915 as being relatively tranquil in an overall context. If you look at what was preoccupying people, you know, there's been a huge transfer of land, for example, so that tenants are becoming owners of land. There have been improvements in diet and in housing overall and in living conditions, notwithstanding the poverty that we're all aware of now in the tenement slums. But, you know, the idea that Ireland in 1915 was poised for rebellion is simply not true. And Desmond Fitzgerald, who ended up here in the GPO in 1916, said specifically or explicitly that it was the mood of despair within nationalism that prompted them to do something desperate. And if you look at the position of Owen McNeill, he was actually very insightful about this, because he knew that there was the possibility of what he described as future political or moral advantage if you made this desperate attempt to rebel. But he was also concerned about the morality of that. It's not justifiable. And of course he has to be kept in the dark. And there are different factions, obviously, in the volunteer movement. If you have a look at what Owen McNeill was trying to figure out in 1915, what would justify rebellion? As far as he was concerned, the conditions clearly did not exist, because the vast majority of people were not looking for rebellion.
Where do women, Roy, fit into all of this? Were they part of this revolutionary world, or were they just tolerated?
They were a central part of the pre-revolutionary world, and they were perhaps a subordinated and marginalised part of the actual revolution when it gets going, when the guys with the guns take over buildings like the one we're sitting in today. But again, I return to the question of the conditioning of the pre-revolutionary state of mind. A lot of that is a feminist conditioning, and a lot of it is secular conditioning. I mean, Dermot is mentioning the Catholicizing, if you like, of the revolutionary input that happens very much after 1916 too. But people like Thomas MacDonagh and James Connolly, much more people like Hannah Sheehy Skeffington and Helena Maloney and Rosamund Jacob and all sorts of radical nationalist women were far from zealous Catholics before the event. And I think it's that secular feminist side that gets lost as well when the revolution takes over.
Dermot, do you think that, you mentioned Desmond Fitzgerald, you mentioned Owen McNeill, where they might have been at, or where their thinking was in 1915. Do you think that there were many outside of the likes of Pearse and Tom Clark, who obviously fervently wished for it, many people who would have thought a year from now we will be involved in a rebellion?
No. When you're asking, did many feel like that? No, they didn't. And there was a reason why there was such secrecy, and why there was that sense of a closed circle involved in organising this, precisely for that reason. They weren't convinced that in 1915 they could bring enough people on board, so they had to organise it in that way. Now, certainly it's true that the longer the war goes on, the more support there is for a more radical form of separatism. But if you look at the dominance of the Irish Parliamentary Party, they still dominate 3/4 of the constituencies in Ireland at that time. Redmond is not quite a busted flush in 1915. We have to be careful about our retrospective analysis in that regard. How did nationalism generally see itself in 1915? That's where, and Roy's really underlying it, that's where all the layers are relevant. But the dominant layer is still pretty moderate.
But what has happened in 1915, remember, too, is that Carson, who has led, anti-democratic, subversive movements in the northeast of the island, Carson has entered Asquith's coalition cabinet, which Redmond has, perforce, had to stay out of. So I think that's an important counter in the demoralising effect of constitutional nationalism. And
by the end of 1915, there are about 16,000 members of the Irish Volunteers. If you have a look at the strength of the Irish Volunteers in 1914 before the split, you can see the way the divide falls. But in a way, it's an advantage for the putative rebels for that split to occur, because they now have a much more concentrated body of more advanced nationalists, as they see themselves, and they can work with that. And even the way the volunteer executive is reconstituted, they can put in their key players, and the IRB key players can infiltrate. So they have that, much more concerted group to work with.
Roy Foster, Dermot Ferreter, thank you both very much indeed. And Dermot and Roy speaking to me a little bit earlier here in the GPO at our Road to the Rising event. You can check out what is happening all around the city centre at rte.ie/1916. We'll be back after the break with fashion, music and the significance of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa's funeral in 1915.
The History Show on RTE Radio 1, live from RTE Road to the Rising.
And welcome back to our History Show special from the GPO on Dublin's O'Connell Street for RTE's Road to the Rising event. The street belongs to the pedestrians today. We're inviting you to come down and to step back into history, to experience the sights and sounds of a century ago. Some of the sights, they include vintage transport, demonstrations about how things were done a century ago, a steam engine, a carousel, a massive gramophone, the list goes on and on. So there's lots and lots for all the family. We've a full day of music and entertainment from the era on our 2 stages on O'Connell Street. And the song that has become perhaps most associated with our event is Macushla, and the Barbershop Quartet 4 in the Bar are among our musical guests today, and here they are with that haunting song.
Macushla, Macushla, your sweet voice is calling, calling me softly again and again. Macushla, Macushla, I hear it still bleeding. My blue-eyed Macushla, I hear it in vain. Macushla, Macushla, your wide arms are reaching. I feel them enfolding, caressing me still. Fling them out from the darkness, my lost love, Macushla. Let them find me and bind me again if they will. Macushla, Macushla, your red lips are saying that death is a dream and love is for aye. Then awaken, Macushla, awake from your dreaming. My blue-eyed Macushla, awaken to stay.
Absolutely beautiful. That was Macushla, sung there by 4 in a Bar, among our musical acts today. The song, of course, made famous by John McCormick. And still to come on our music hall stage are Cor Coulee, Bioga, Jack L and the High Kings.
The defenders of this realm have worked well, in secret and in the open. They think that they have pacified Ireland. They think that they have purchased half of us and intimidated the other half. They think that they have foreseen everything, that they have provided against everything. But the fools, the fools, the fools! They have left us our Fenian dead. And while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace.
The climactic closing words of the graveside oration given by Patrick Pearse at the funeral of Jeremiah O'Donovan Rossa in August 1915, obviously, I beg your pardon. It remains one of the most famous speeches in Irish history, and that reading is courtesy of Glasnevin Cemetery, where the speech is reenacted every day at 2:30 in the afternoon. Gabriel Doherty from University College Cork, who gave a talk about O'Donovan Rossa in the Gresham a little while ago, joins me now. First of all, remind us, who was O'Donovan Rossa?
He was the single most well-known Fenian going back to the origins of the movement in the 1850s and the 1860s. He had been incarcerated, had suffered appallingly, as well, the Abu Ghraib scandal of the British prison system in the 19th century. He'd been forced to emigrate to America. He was actively involved in the dynamite campaign while in America. And upon his death on the 29th of June in 1915, it was decided to bring his body back to Dublin for burial in Glasnevin Cemetery.
And this was part of a great tradition of Irish political funerals, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that tradition, of course, continues afterwards, because you have the funerals of Thomas Ashe and Kevin Barry, etc.
Terence McSweeney and Thomas McCurtain in Cork.
The last great one would have been, I suppose, Parnell's. But I think that O'Donovan Ross's funeral is bigger than them all, simply because the timing is absolutely crucial. It's when the war is going badly, the Western Front is stalemated, Gallipoli is turning into a catastrophe. Even those moderate home rulers who have thrown their hat at the engagement with the war as a counterpoint for the concession of home rule are starting to worry about that. And there is a distinct radicalisation of opinion during 1915, and the funeral just encapsulates it, comes at the perfect moment.
And of course, one of the fascinating things about the funeral of O'Donovan Rossa is that we have film footage of it, most famously, I think, seen in Misha Era. But the funeral is finished, the coffin has been lowered, and then stepping out from the crowd is this individual who would not have been particularly well known at the time, Patrick Pearse.
He certainly wouldn't have been well known outside of Dublin. He would have been well known in Dublin cultural circles and Irish language cultural circles nationally because of his position. But this is his moment in the sun where he strikes, and the speech is extensively reported in the press subsequently. And of course, with the benefit of hindsight, we can now see that it was a large step on the road to the rising.
Now, it has been suggested, though, that O'Donovan Rossa, he had changed. He was a changed man. That the man who was actually interred in Glasnevin was very different from the man who had participated in, and in a sense had led, had collected money for, and had been involved in the bomb plots of the 1880s. Is that the case?
It was certainly an idea that was propagated by many of those associated with Home Rule, precisely because the Home Rule cause was starting to run into trouble, and there was a need, as it were, to get the lustre of such a famous name. Certainly O'Donovan Ross's widow, when she arrives in Dublin and hears that these reports have been coming through, is at pains to deny it, and she stresses that he had been true to his Fenian principles until death.
Because there was a suggestion that he had essentially turned into a Redmondite, and that he was endorsing Redmond.
And again, I think that's precisely because the cause of Redmondism is struggling by the summer of 1915.
Now, did Pearse have any idea? Obviously, Pearse intended his speech to have an impact. Did he have any idea that it would have the impact that it did?
He couldn't have. At this stage, of course, we know now, again with the benefit of hindsight, that the rising would take place. And at the rhetorical level, of course, there are these overtones of the proclamation in the speech. But there are other links between the funeral and the 1916 rising. The entire leadership cadre of 1916 is in the organising committee. All 7 signatories come together for the first time. 2 other of those who were executed. The whole of the Labour movement comes on board. Cumann na mBan comes on board. And it's also the first point at which the Irish Volunteers and the Irish Citizen Army collaborate. But perhaps even more important than that was that this is the moment at which the breach between Fenianism and Catholicism starts to be healed. Of course, this had been a very antagonistic relationship up to now, and certain Fenians had been denied a church funeral, and here the church threw its hat at this funeral. And of course, the final point with regard to the link to the rising is the mass turnout of the population for the rising. I suggested earlier on at my talk that it must have made an impression on people like Pearse and Connolly to see the most hardline name in the canon of Irish republicanism generating public support to that extent. And surely this must have influenced them in their expectations of what would happen when the rising took place for real.
And I think the funeral itself is going to be central in the context of the commemoration of the 100th anniversary of the 1916 rising. In a sense, it will kick it off in August of this year.
I should know I'm involved in the commemoration of the O'Donovan Rossa funeral in Skibbereen and in West Cork, but we're delighted to see that the first event on the official programme launched last week is the state commemoration on the 1st of August in Glasnevin, and it is a state event. And I think that is very, very important to note.
Of course, as I said, it is reenacted every day in Glasnevin Cemetery at 2:30. Gabriel, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Gabriel Doherty of University College Cork. And obviously we're going to be hearing a lot more about the centenary of O'Donovan Rossa's death in the coming months. Now, those of you who make it along to O'Connell Street today will see hundreds of volunteer actors, I think 300 altogether, in period dress, from a wedding party in their finery at one end of O'Connell Street to, unfortunately, sadly, funeral mourners in black at the other end. But what about everyday clothes in 1915? What were the citizens of our capital city wearing? Flora McCarthy pieces together the fashion trends of 100 years ago.
In my sweet little Alice blue gown.
Dublin in 1915, and everything is changing, not least the fashion.
It's one of those great moments when fashion changes, and there's a huge distinction between what people used to wear and what young people are wearing.
Dr. Hilary O'Kelly lectures in fashion at the National College of Art and Design. She says the heavy, restrictive clothing worn by the Victorians held no appeal for modern young Irish women.
The big difference for them is that their grandmother would be in a boned bodice and a long skirt, but these young women will be in what were called costumes, a tailored jacket and skirt with a blouse.
Sensible clothing, it's wartime, and women are on the move like never before.
Now women are going to work, they're getting their own money, they're going on buses, they're maybe even cycling bicycles. So apart from sensible looking shoes or comfortable shoes you could walk in, you would also carry a handbag, which is the first time the term handbag comes into use, is in the beginning of the 20th century.
They were summoned from the hillside, they were called in from the glen, and the country found them ready at the stirring call for men.
It's a year before the Easter Rising, but a year into the First World War. Katrina Crowe from the National Archives says the war had a huge impact on fashion.
Material is in less supply than it was before the war, because material is being snaffled up to make uniforms and bandages and all the other things that a war requires. So hemlines get shorter and skirts get narrower. Ankles suddenly appear properly for the first time, which means shoes are more important, and miraculously metal is in short supply. Therefore the corset becomes something that's undesirable, apart from being a thing that caused immense agony.
So the corset is out, the bra is in, hemlines are rising, and Clearys, Arnott's, Switzers and Brown Thomas are in business. But not for everyone.
You know, most ordinary women, certainly working class women from the tenements, couldn't have afforded to shop in Cleary's. The cheapest hat in the sale in 1913 was 6 and 6, and if you consider that the average salary for a domestic servant was 7 shillings a week, that would be almost a week's salary, which would take a long time, and that was in the sale.
But hats were important. At the time, Dublin had 3,000 milliners, along with 6,000 dressmakers.
A young modern woman might go into town without her gloves on, but the old lady certainly won't. And they will all wear hats. You know, some of the men could walk into town today and look exactly the same. You know, a tailored suit and white shirt and a tie.
Till it wilted, I wore it, I'll always adore it. My sweet little Alice blue gown.
Anna Davies, head of St Vincent de Paul's vintage collection, is helping more than 300 volunteers to get dressed for today's events on O'Connell Street. So what's her advice for looking the part?
So I kind of told people to, really focus on jewellery, or really focus on the hair or the hat or the veil or the shoes, or, if you can nail one part, one aspect of the 1915 look, you'll be very convincing. And it even comes down to posture.
Oscar Wilde famously said, fashion should change every 6 months. But Coco Chanel said style endures. So, a style tip for 2015, vintage is back. Maybe those grandmothers were right all along.
My sweet little Alice blue gown.
And if you'd like to see living examples of those 1915 fashions, come on down to O'Connell Street. Now, before we go, I want to have a word with Catherine McSharry from the National Library, who, with her team here in the GPO, have been assessing people's family memorabilia, artefacts, all kinds of things from the Easter Rising, from the revolutionary period, and all that has been going on and is continuing as we speak. Underneath us, that's the hubbub that you can hear throughout, or have been able to hear throughout the programme. Catherine, did you come in here with any expectations, any hopes of what you might actually find, or people might bring into you?
I suppose what we wanted to find out in the first instance is what was out there related to 1916, what was in biscuit tins and attics. And I didn't actually have a great sense of how much material there might be. It's different from something like World War I, where there were so many people involved, and we know a lot of people have memorabilia. So I suppose what we wanted to find out was, is there stuff out there? And the answer is, yes, there is. Yeah, and give us an example of some of the stuff that you got. I mean, for example, I think a rather interesting marriage certificate. Yes, well, so this is one of my own favourite items from the day. It's a gentleman whose grandparents got married on Easter Monday 1916. Interesting enough in itself. He has their marriage certificate. Interesting. Their best man, who came to the ceremony, signed the certificate, then came in here to the GPO to fight, having said, listen lads, I'll be with you at 12, I have to go to a wedding first. Okay, right. And there's a coin which is in some way associated with Sean McDermott. Explain that to me. Yeah, so this is a gentleman who's been in America most of his life and whose family had extensive revolutionary connections, particularly with the IRB and with Devoy. And he has a coin that's said to have been in Sean McDermott's pocket when he was executed. So, pretty impressive. And also a copy of the sign-in book. Where was it? In Jacob's Biscuit Factory? Explain that to me. That's right. So a lady who came into us whose grandparents both worked in the Jacob's Biscuit Factory. They were at work on Easter Monday, as normal, when the rebels came in, occupied the building and gave them the day off. But she has a copy of where the workers would have signed in on that day. And as it turned out, they got a lot more than the day off. They got the rest of the week off. Well, exactly. Perhaps a little bit beyond that. I did suggest a couple of weeks ago on the programme that maybe somebody would come in here with an original proclamation. Who knows how many of them are still out there. 2,500 of them were printed, but I suppose most of them ended up where they were supposed to end up, which was on walls. Yeah, well, I suppose by their nature they were very transitory things. It's surprising that any have survived, really, and it's not surprising that they're so rare. And while we didn't get any original proclamations, we did get the grandson of the man who printed the proclamation in the basement of Liberty Hall. And that was Christopher Brady, was it? Brady, that's right, yes. Yeah. So his grandson and his family came in to be here today to remember their grandfather, who played such a seminal part in the origins of the Rising. What else has attracted your attention in the course of the day? We've seen some amazingly large collections of material. So families who were involved from 1916 all the way to 1923. So you have a family, for instance, who has letters from all of the signatories of the proclamation, who have a copy of the certificate that was given to anybody who was involved in the revolutionary struggle through all of those years. And just there's something incredibly evocative when someone comes in with an item in Pearce's really distinctive handwriting, and you know that someone in their family received it firsthand nearly 100 years ago, and they've treasured it all this time since, and it's here in the GPO on Easter Monday. I mean, that's a real spine-tingling moment. How are you going to follow all of this up? I mean, what are you doing with this material at the moment? Are you in any sense recording it? Are you photographing it? What are you doing with it? So what we wanted to do today is to bring people in and for us to record what they have, just to write down the details of what they have. And that's preparatory to a series of digitisation and oral history projects that we'll be running with the GPO and An Post over the next number of months. So we can digitise all of this material, make sure that it's available to everybody online and that it's preserved for the long term, which is obviously one of the things that the families want to see happen. Now, the process continues. It is continuing as we speak. What would you, if I was to ask you, what's the one thing that you would hope would walk in that door between now and 5 o'clock this evening? What would it be? Photographs. So photographs of Easter week and of the Rising. There are so few of them. We've all seen the ones that are out there multiple times. A lady did come into us whose father was a photographer and who took press photographs, and I haven't seen yet what she brought in, so fingers crossed there's going to be something amazing there. So photographs of, say, O'Connell Street in ruins. I mean, there are some of those. There are a number of those that do exist. So, I mean, anything that would show the city during that week outside of the standard photographs that we've seen, the dream is that somebody unknown took photographs inside any of the sites. As yet, none of those have ever come to light, but we can but hope.
Okay, well, we've got another couple of hours for people to bring in. And if you have any photographs or think you have any photographs, and you would certainly make Catherine's day and make a lot of people's day down there from the National Library if we were to bring those in. It's a busy day for you, Catherine. Thank you very, very much indeed. So I will let you go. And it's also time for us to go as well. But before we do, a lot of people to thank. First of all, the hundreds of people, I'm not going to thank them individually, obviously, who volunteered their time and their skills to make this day a success, including 300 people, as I said, who've been walking up and down O'Connell Street dressed in Edwardian costume. Many thanks too to our researcher on the programme, Lorcan Clancy, also Mick McLaughlin and Dave Gibson on sound at the GPO this afternoon, and in studio back at base, Ronan Kelly and Mark Dwyer. RTE Road to the Rising continues until 5 o'clock this afternoon, as does our live coverage on RTE Radio 1. Next up is the special edition of Arena, featuring the RTE Concert Orchestra and guests. That's it from me, Myles Dungan, and producer Yeti Redmond, coming to you on this special afternoon from the GPO in the heart of Dublin's O'Connell Street. And congratulations indeed due to Yeti Redmond in particular for bringing this huge logistical effort together, and more particularly, I think, for organising the weather as well. Nothing is beyond the compass of this extraordinary woman. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.